I'm Dr. Steve Claypool, and I'm reviewing the evidence base on carbohydrates. In my first two videos, I reviewed glycemic index. I'm now going to explore specific foods. Since I've already reviewed fruits in a different video, I'm not going to cover them. They're good for you. I also reviewed dairy products in the saturated fat video, and I'll cover legumes in an upcoming video. Besides, when most of you think of carbs, you think of the remaining foods: potatoes, rice, wheat, and other grains. Let's not forget sugar. Let's start with rice. Meta-analysis of multiple studies confirms that white rice consumption is associated with an increased risk of diabetes, as would be expected considering its glycemic index. It's also associated with obesity. Overall, white rice is bad for you, but it's not as bad for you as its extremely high glycemic index would suggest, based on these studies, which do not show a significantly increased risk of mortality from rice. Brown rice, as opposed to white rice, has not been associated with diabetes or obesity. Next up, potatoes. As expected, potatoes and French fries are strongly associated with diabetes. In this study in women, just 2 servings per week was associated with an increased risk of 16%, and the risk goes up with more potato consumption. So even very small amounts of potato consumption increase risk. In comparison, whole grain consumption instead of potatoes is associated with a reduced risk. Potatoes are also associated with hypertension. These 3 studies indicate that people with higher consumption are more likely to develop high blood pressure, and substituting potatoes for low glycemic index foods reduces the risk of high blood pressure. This is an expected finding because high glycemic index foods cause hypertension. Potatoes are likely associated with the other effects of high glycemic index foods, for example, obesity, elevated triglycerides, and premature death, but unfortunately, there have not been studies that have specifically isolated potatoes to explore these. As of now, the best evidence suggests potatoes are bad for us. Corn has a high glycemic index too. Unfortunately, there are no studies that specifically analyze corn's association with obesity, diabetes, and death. Until specific studies are conducted, I assume it's similar to potatoes and rice. It's possible it isn't as unhealthy though, because it's a whole grain. But I suspect in this case that corn is bad for us despite the fact that it's a whole grain, because of its high glycemic index. Let me explain the difference between whole and refined grains. Refined grains differ from whole grains in that the bran and germ have been removed. They therefore have less fiber than whole grains because they only contain the endosperm. Wait! Who thought of these names? Germ and endosperm? I don't want to eat foods called germ and endosperm. Anyway, for whole grains, the extra bran tends to slow digestion and absorption of the carbs, so the glycemic index is lower, although it's possible that phytochemicals from the germ contribute to healthiness in ways that we don't fully understand. But I believe the primary reason whole grains are healthier is that the extra fiber prevents the carb digestion from stressing the insulin system. For this reason, I doubt it matters much that corn is still a whole grain, because despite the presence of its bran husk, it still has a very high glycemic index. More study is needed on corn, but for now, I cautiously recommend that corn be considered to be an unhealthy food commensurate with its glycemic index. Note that in studies on whole grain, corn is usually not included. It is not studied as a whole grain in medical studies, yet the FDA labeling allows corn-based products to be labeled as whole grains, which is problematic. More on that later. Next, let's look at wheat, starting with white flour. Despite the fact that white flour is one of the most commonly consumed foods, there is limited data isolating white flour from other foods in trials, but there's some data. From this trial in adolescents, we know that heavy consumers of white flour are about 50% more likely to develop metabolic syndrome, which includes high blood pressure, obesity, abnormal cholesterol levels, and diabetes. Diabetes, hypertension, obesity, and cholesterol abnormalities are all expected given the high glycemic index, and the impact starts in childhood. This study of Chinese people compared the risk of death from ischemic heart disease in people stratified by their consumption of different carbohydrate-rich foods. As expected, based on glycemic index data, people that ate whole wheat and fruit had lower risk of heart disease, whereas rice and white flour wheat had higher risk. But the most interesting finding is that people that ate white flour did not have a lower risk of heart disease than people that ate white rice, despite the fact that noodles have a lower glycemic index. So we cannot absolutely say that the glycemic index stratifies risk. From the available data, white flour and rice are both bad for you, but we cannot say that one is worse than the other. Our society is starting to develop a strong opinion that white flour and rice are evil. They are bad for us, but the impact is fairly modest. In this study, white flour and rice were only associated with a greater risk for death from heart disease in women, not men, and the risk was 8%. That's right, only in women. And this is specifically heart disease, not all-cause mortality, which is impacted even less. This is modest compared to the risk profile of other foods I've covered, for example, red meat, which is closer to 20%, and fruits, veggies, nuts, fish, which are good for us and reduce the risk by a much larger percentage. So don't get carried away thinking avoiding white flour and rice should be your greatest nutritional goal. It shouldn't. In fact, avoiding white flour and rice shouldn't be in your top 5 nutritional changes. Some of you smart ones are thinking something doesn't jive because you know the Mediterranean diet is good for you, but you also know pasta is common in the Mediterranean diet. And you remember that pasta has a lower glycemic index than white flour bread. Are pasta and white bread nutritionally different in terms of disease risk? Direct study of pasta versus bread in patients with diabetes suggests that pasta has a more modest impact on control of blood sugars, which isn't surprising because pasta has a lower glycemic index. And although it hasn't been directly studied, this suggests that pasta also carries less risk of developing diabetes in normal people than does bread. And the same is likely true of obesity, hypertension, abnormal cholesterol levels, and heart disease. There hasn't been a direct comparison of pasta versus bread, but the risk from pasta is presumably less than the risk from bread. There is additional data giving us reason to believe that pasta made from white flour is not as bad for us as bread made from white flour. Pasta is likely a fairly neutral food. This is probably especially true if pasta is served al dente. When cooked longer, pasta's glycemic index rises. When cooked less and more firm, the glycemic index is lower and therefore likely healthier, although more study is needed on that too. In summary, we should reduce consumption of white rice, potatoes, corn, and breads made from white flour because they're not good for us. Pasta is a neutral food. In my next video, I'll cover whole grains.